We are here for one of the conversations on Italian and international culture at the Olga Ragusa Foundation for the Humanities. I'm Andrea Ciccarelli, the president of the Ragusa Foundation, and I have the pleasure today to have with me Professor Fabio Finotti, the director of the Italian Cultural Institute of New York, professor of Italian Literature and Culture in the Department of Humanistic Studies at the University of Trieste, and Mariano Di Vito, Professor Emeritus of Italian Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Finotti is an extremely active scholar, administrator, and organizer. He is president of the national edition of the works of Antonio Fogazzaro, member of the Olympic Academy in Vicenza, serves on the boards of directors of several scholarly journals and editorial series, and has been for many years the president of the International Association for the Studies of Italian Language and Literature. Fabio Finotti is definitely the right person to talk, in fact, to listen to, about Italian identities and the secular debate about the national and transnational role of Italian culture. The working title of our conversation today, Fabio, is Italian Culture Abroad, History, Roles and Expectations, but it is a working title, of course. Professor Finotti's long-standing academic experience at the University of Trieste, an institution for its geocultural position as a well-known multicultural and multilingual vocation, his work as director of the Center for Italian Studies when at the University of Pennsylvania, together with his work for the AISLI, attest his devotion to the intersection between national tradition and their projection abroad, focusing on different genres and artistic codes and media. Almost all his publications touch upon problems that relate to local, national, global issues or representations. Even when his works may seem remote from the national and international identity debate, they deal with it very closely. For instance, I'm thinking about his book on art and literature in the Italian Renaissance course, Retorica della diffrazione, Bembo, Aretino, Giulio Romano e Tasso, published by Olsky in Florence in 2004. The theoretical debates about art, language, and literature in the Italian course of the time were, in fact, an attempt to propose and impose a social political model over the others, and given the artistic and cultural influence of the Italian course at the time, these models automatically became transnationals as they were discussed and adopted throughout Europe. And yet we know that the lack of political and geographical unity in Italy has paradoxically perpetuated a conflictual search for a national identity that has slowed down or confused the awareness of a modern projection abroad until at least the First World War. In this regard, Professor Finotti has devoted much attention to the Italian cultural developments from the mid-1800s to the first part of the 20th century. Here we should mention at least some of these books that pertain more closely to today's conversation, which, I repeat, focuses on the eternal question about the regional, national, and transnational identity of Italian culture, as well as its impact, projection, and perception abroad. Some of these books are L'Italia allo specchio, Linguaggi e identità italiane nel mondo, with Marina Johnston, published in 2014 by Marsilio, Italia, l'invenzione della patria, published in 2016 by Bompiani, and last but not least, Una ferita non chiusa, misticismo, filosofia, letteratura in Prezzolini e nel primo Novecento, published by Olsky in 1992. This last publication, even if it's the farthest one of the three that I've just mentioned, this last publication on Prezzolini brings us closer, in a sense, to the heart of the matter. If I'm not wrong, in fact, Professor Finotti and I have been knowing each other for a while, so we are going to call it, ci daremo del tu. And quindi, if I'm not wrong, Fabio, you told me that when you moved to the United States, one of the first people that you visited with was Olga Ragusa, who is the namesake and the engine behind our foundation. This is probably not a coincidence, as Ragusa was a student, a collaborator, and a scholar of Prezzolini, as well as the daughter of Andrea Ragusa, publisher of Vanni, with whom Prezzolini cooperated on several projects from the 1930s to the 1950s when he lived in New York, where he was a professor at Columbia University. In a sense, as Prezzolini's old friend Papini would say, il cerchio si chiude. Your career as a scholar and cultural organizer has come a full circle, in a sense, propelling and fostering Italian cultural activities in the United States from the very same city chosen by Prezzolini. If you like to say something about your...
No, I would like to think about a spiral much more than a circle, because the circle gives the impression that the experience is closed.
That's very true and very good. Of course, we don't want you to finish now. We want you to last for many, many years to come. Thank you. I will ask a few questions, which are really just some spunti, as we would say in Italian, and Professor Finotti can answer as long and in as short way as he pleases, really. We know that Prezzolini's main goal, Fabio, was that of rejuvenating the image of Italian culture. In the perennial quest for new artistic spaces, he insisted on a fresh Italian identity, free of his famous but suffocating tradition. Pushing the past to the side did not mean for Prezzolini giving up or diminishing the lesson of tradition, but simply channeling more attention to new and different aesthetic endeavors. And in fact, when he was a professor at Columbia University, Prezzolini taught the classics for many years and decades. But he kept cooperating with local and Italian institutions, including Andrea Ragusa, the owner of Vanni, the bookstore and publishing house, which was an Italian cultural hub at the time in New York, to bring writers and artists to the United States. In this respect, it is interesting to mention a book which is not so known by Prezzolini, The Legacy of Italy, one of the New York book, published by Vanni in 1948, because it has been judged by many critics, many scholars, as a traditional way of conceiving Italian culture. A book that lacked clarity about why, who, and what shaped this declared legacy, the legacy of Italian culture, according to many critics. In retrospect, I believe, and I may be wrong, that actually one may argue that with the legacy, Prezzolini was otherwise preoccupied, stressing that the undeniable and recognizable historical legacy of Italy to Western cultural legacy to Western civilization was indeed a double-edged blessing. It was an anchor that kept and keeps Italy afloat, even during turbulent times, and yet an anchor that keeps Italy chained to a point, almost preventing it from sailing towards new enterprises. What is your assessment on this matter? Was Prezzolini predicament off target? Do we see a similar incompatible situation today? And of course, I can rephrase the questions later on, because I know there are many.
Thank you, Lea. I think that during the 19th century, the United States, the culture of the United States has been a sort of paradigm that helped many intellectuals and many writers to go against literature, which doesn't mean against the writers, of course, but against a sort of illness of Italian tradition. Literature, the idea that writing is first of all a question of style, of form, of tradition, of memory, of words. And from the beginning of the 20th century, we see this sort of fight against literature in Prezzolini, but after Prezzolini, for instance, in Pavese, in neo-realism, and always with a very strong component of the American model, because writers like, for instance, Hemingway, like Steinbeck, were the models of an anti-literature, a sort of oxymoron or paradox. And in the case of Prezzolini, this issue was very clear also from the point of view of the style, because he was, like a Croce, a real rejuvenator, real recreator of the Italian style from the beginning of 20th century, with a sort of a journalistic style that changed completely the structure of the phrase, with a more simplified syntax, the use of the words, with a more with the strongest connection with the contemporary vocabulary, and also in the structure of the discourse in general, with a prevalence of a dialogue, of a sort of interior dialogue made by answer question. So this was what brought Prezzolini to France at the beginning of the century, and this was also what brought him to the United States. And of course, this connection affected also his view of Italian tradition and of Italian legacy. I think that the most interesting aspect of his suggestions are the fact that Italian legacy is not made only by writers such as Petrarch, for instance, or Leopardi, but by intellectuals that deal with the non-literary questions, like Machiavelli, who was one of the pillars of his vision. From this point of view, his book and his suggestions are extremely relevant, because all the relation between the United States and the Italian culture after World War II is based exactly on this new pattern, where, for instance, not only Machiavelli, but Vico, Gramsci becomes as much important, as much relevant as traditional writers like Alfieri, Manzoni, or Petrarch. And even Dante is recognized as an intellectual, not only as a writer. So the so-called non-poetical part, poesia, non-poesia, the division that Croce made in his essays on Dante, suggesting that we should throw the non-poetic part of the Divine Comedy, doesn't make any more sense, because the so-called non-literary or non-poetic part are as relevant as the other one from the intellectual point of view. This is, I think, a part of the suggestion of Prezzolini that we should remember, we should recognize, and also that made him able to see the relations very well, the relations between the Italian culture and the other cultures in Europe and in the world. From this point of view, it's not a case that Ragusa, not only for family reasons, of course, or professional reasons, but she was very linked to Prezzolini's model, also because of intellectual reasons, because Olga Ragusa too had this interest towards non-literary tradition, or tradition who put in question the traditional idea, the old idea of literacy, and for the relations between different cultures and different identities.
Thank you, thank you. This is all very clear. This is all very clear, and I had no doubts that you will give us a very thorough question if I brought this issue up. And now to come to a more specific question in regards to your role as the director of the Italian Cultural Institute of New York, one of the most prestigious, actually perhaps the most prestigious Italian Cultural Institute abroad. And I know, by the way, you just told me that you are also acting as cultural for the Italian Cultural Institute of Washington. So congratulations, and of course, good luck for this double task. Your position offers you the opportunity to assess and evaluate the standing of Italian cultural activities and their effect on the international scene, especially regarding their cultural perception and evolution. What is your assessment of the roles, the challenges, and impact of Italian culture abroad in the current transnational debate? And for transnational, of course, I implied, I mean, that term in all the possible meanings that is used nowadays in the academic or intellectual world.
Yes, it's interesting that living in the United States, everybody can realize that in the perception of Americans, but probably in all over the world, there are at least two Italies. There is one Italy there is the Italy of the past, the Italy of the Renaissance. So people look at you thinking he's an Italian, they never had a revolution, he's still someone, a person of the Renaissance. Because we are very different from French or English people or American people. No revolution at all. A very strong relation with our tradition, also in our scholastic system. If we think that we still have something like the classical high school, il liceo classico, or even the liceo scientifico, where we study some topics that Americans maybe find only in the universities, like Latin, Greek, and philosophy, which is absolutely something that the American student or the global student usually don't deal with. So there is on one side this Italy, and the people love it, and they look at the Italian Cultural Institute as a place where they can come and find the discourse of that exhibitions, seminars. We had, for instance, some seminars about the Medici in relation to the exhibition that reopened the Metropolitan Museum, also about the food and the poisons of the Medici. So all that pertains to this long millennial, we could say, tradition. Then there is the other Italy, the Italy which is totally projected in the present and onto the future, the Italy of the fashion, the Italy of the cars, the Italy of the sport. I mean, there are a lot of people who know very well Dolce & Gabbana, Armani, Versace, but who don't know at all Leopardi, Manzoni, or Petrarch. So there is a very strong division between these two Italies. And then, of course, in the United States, there is the third Italy, the Italy that brings with it the memory of the migrations, the Italy of the Italo-Americans, the so-called Italo-Americans, that in great part were not properly definable as Italian, because they arrived in the United States without having a language, and in many times also with the strong sense of disaffection towards the nation. So they are linked very much to their region, to their village, to their dialect, less linked to the nation as a whole, to the idea of a post-united Italy. And this is a completely different Italy from the Italy of the fashion on one side, and from the Italy of the tradition, cultural, the high cultural tradition. Because the high cultural tradition from Dante on, let's think about the De Vulgari Eloquentia, was able to unify Italy from the cultural and linguistic point of view. It was, Italy is the only country, I think, where the language was not produced by the invasion of one city over the entire state, but was self-induced by intellectual. It was a choice, not a necessity. This choice was very strength, it was very effective, but it concerned only a small part of the population, because when the migration started, the number of analphabets, of people who couldn't read or write, was extremely high. So all these people were foreigners in a way. They did not belong to the high tradition of Italian culture from Dante on. So we have these three Italies, and sometimes one Italy is fighting against the other. For instance, I would not mention here all the polemics about Columbus, but it's clear that on one side we have the scientific research, the cultural Italy that can take some position against Columbus. On the other side, we have the migrants, the son of the migrants, who feel, and with many reasons, that Columbus is a symbol, a sign of their identity. So the institute, I would say, should exhibit, should be a place where these three Italies are recognized and also are connected. Should be a place where we should reconnect these identities, having this always in mind, that Italy was, is, and I hope will be, a place of multiple identities, because as Dante wrote in the Vulgare Eloquenza, also choosing one language does not cancel the multiplicity of dialects. So choosing one root does not cancel the other roles. And this is something that we should explain also to non-Italian people, that Italy, like in the Commedia dell'arte, is made by many characters, many languages, many traditions.
Thank you. I fully agree with you. And of course, you're right. Choosing one language, Italy is a country of multiple language and multilingual, multiple culture. We often forget that in the 1800s, you need a passport to go from Milan to Venice,
yes.
Or from Rome to Naples.
Yes.
And when we're talking about big distances, of course, Foscolo was considered estero by the Milanese Austrian police, and so
and in the university,
if you go to the Halle, to the Biblioteca Braidense, you can see it is registered as estero letterato. And of course, we would never think for a moment that Ugo Foscolo, the author of Sepolcri, was considered not Italian by the police in Milan. So what you say is actually very, very, very true, and I imagine it's a very difficult task, the one that you have, but I'm sure you're doing very well, and you will keep doing it very well to amalgamate, to keep addressing all these issues at the same time. Thank you again. And one thing I wanted to ask you as a scholar, because you are one of the best scholars of Italian studies, and this is why you have been asked to be also the director, because of your ability as a scholar and as an organizer and an administrator, of course, to be the director of the Italian Cultural Institute. And so I wanted to ask you about the status a little bit of the arts and humanities, in the sense that arts and humanities, like anything else, evolve with time. I'm not teaching, we are not teaching what I was teaching 20 years ago. It's normal that there are things that change continuously. What is old-fashioned today was dashingly new yesterday, but we tend to forget that. Their perception changes with societal and cultural developments that often respond to a concrete and effective evolution of the cultural fabric, while at times they may be subjected or subjugated almost to the emotional more than cultural interpretation, more than intellectual interpretation, emotional interpretation of the moment. Do you see these different aspects in contemporary society in the United States and in Italy and also elsewhere? And what is your idea, your assessment about these inevitable fluctuations about arts and humanities and what they represent for culture?
When I teach in the United States and when I teach in Italy, I perceive a very, very strong difference in my students and in what I am expected to teach. In the United States, in some way, the humanistic studies must always defend or in a way justify their existence, linking them to something else, linking literature to politics, to economy, to social issues, gender, making a sort of study that is able to speak about the past, but also about the future. So it's a way of using, in a way, literature for the present and for a sort of political action. In Italy, I can speak of Petrarch, speaking only about Petrarch. I mean, I can spend a week working on the sound of the language of Petrarch. There is a much more, there is a much stronger sensibility towards the aesthetic, what I would say, the aesthetic aspect, which was in a way what Prezzolini and many others were going against, but we have still that part which is so strong and which is fundamental, because when I speak with many colleagues also in the States, they tell me, oh, your language is wonderful, is beautiful. They speak about aesthetics, about beauty. In the States, for me, it would be very difficult to give a lesson, give a course about the beauty of a poetry. It's not something you usually deal with. You speak about a poet, for instance, speaking about the social or political aspect of his poetics or the historical aspect. So this is a big difference. And this is a question also, a more general question. Think about architecture. The idea that a building must be functional is a very strong idea, but I think that it pertains to the past. Now, with the new sense of a sustainable world, we are reevaluating also the so-called aesthetic aspects of our life, of our building, of our relation, and of writings. So I think that from this point of view, we should defend the fact that in the same way a painter is working with the colors, a writer is working with words. This is a point that for me is crucial in my activity, and I hope it will be clear when we will host during the next year 2 big events. One, a sort of a general panorama of poetry organized by Luigi Ballerini, 2 days of poetic readings between Italy and the States, and then 2 days devoted to Italian new narrative, to Italian new narrators organized by Maria Ida Gaeta. And we will bring here 3 generations of writers. And of course, we will speak about what literature or humanistic culture is, and we will deal about also the differences between Italy and the education in Italy and in the States. Last but not least, I think that on the other side, this intercultural, interdisciplinary approach to not only literature but art, everything, I think it's very useful. And we are going, for instance, to organize a big exhibition about Frederick II and the Regno Normanno, the reign of Sicily, where the first Italian poets were born, actually, before the Tuscan poets. And it will be a great occasion to bring together poetry, philosophy, religion, because of course there were discourses with many different faiths, like the Muslim, the Jewish, the Byzantine, etc. It will be also an occasion of speaking about manufacturers, about social life, etc. So I think that interdisciplinary approach can be very reviving in a way, because you can see with different, with new eyes to old products, to old monuments.
Thank you, thank you. No, that's very clear. It's very interesting to hear all the events that you are organizing. These two events about writers and poets, but all the other things. I'm very glad to hear that you're doing this, and these are all very important things for Italian culture, of course, in New York and the United States. You mentioned something, so in a sense, going back to Prezzolini a little bit, we know this. I mean, his targets were not really the classics. His targets was the way the classics were used to create a shadow over anything that was considered not as important. And so the issue, for instance, of the importance of intellectuals for Italian culture abroad, and not just Italian literature, for instance, or art. But basically, his point was, in a sense, that Dante, Michelangelo, Verdi, and so on and so forth, do not really need advertising. They can be studied and noticed and studied abroad without the Italians. They don't need the Italians, in a sense. They are already so famous that they don't need Italy or the Italians to promote them. Whereas he was saying, in a sense, the new ambitious artistic endeavor and plans, of the time, actually did need help, and they do need help even nowadays, because of course, if you are less famous, you hope that somebody may help you to become more famous, and so that you can be noticed. And so how valid is this message, and how do we balance the cultural offer of an Italian cultural institute like yours, but the one you direct, but also in general in the academic world and in general, how do we balance the cultural offer between new and old? For an old, of course, I intend the tradition, yes. Traditional figure. I don't intend old in the sense that they are old-fashioned. Between experimental and established, in other words, yes. Between what is genial, what is brilliant, and what is commercial, because there is also the commercial aspect. I mean, there are cultural products that are commercial and they are famous out there, and they need to be noticed as well. How do we balance, how do we offer this, how do we balance this? Especially in a city like New York, because the truth is New York is a perfect place for all these contradictions, in a sense.
For instance, I told you that we are organizing this events on Italian narrative, and it will be an event that will bring together 3 different generations. So I don't want to say that the first one is the old one, but of course you can see a development, a change. You can have the most famous writers of the first generation, like Veronesi, Caro Files, and the new ones who are changing the landscape of Italian narrative. And it will be beautiful also to hear the dialogue between these different generations, because history is not only the past, it's also what's going on, and we can experience it also in our contemporaneity. So this is the first answer, but there is a more general aspect. Thank you very much for your question, because this is one of the basis of our work, to propose people who young people who deal with the memory of the past. Because we are in after postmodernism, people are not afraid anymore of a tradition of past. Of course, they are using it in a non-historical perspective. So they are changing it, but there is a strong relation. For the point of view, for instance, of this relation, we had some conversations. You know that we organized a new website, Stanze Italiane, where we publish conversations, seminars, exhibitions, etc. Since something we can do, some of our activities can be done in presence, many of them now with the COVID must be done only on the web. So in this website, in the so-called gallery, you will find some conversations of Laura Mattioli, who is the president of the Center for Italian Modern Art, about contemporary American artists who deal with the Italian artistic tradition. So there is a strict connection between the work of one artist, for instance, a painting of Piero della Francesca. This is something that speaks a lot about this relation, which is fundamental also in Dante, because the 20th century taught us that we have to go to search in the books the so-called intertextual relations. That is, that every book, every painting, in a way, dialogue with the past, recreate the past, and define itself using its relation with the past. It's a completely new way of dealing, of treating this argument with the reference to the 19th century, when they did the so-called critique of the roots, and they thought that the past produced the present. No, the present produces in a way the past. And this is what we are doing, for instance, with the conversation of Laura Mattioli, but also with some of our exhibitions. For instance, we had an exhibition about Scagliola, which is an old way of imitating marble, used, for instance, in altars, used in furniture in the Renaissance and after Renaissance. It's an old and very difficult way. And we had some artists in the American artists in the institute who went to Italy, studied the technique of Scagliola, and are now doing their own works using the technique, but in completely new way. So this is another way of treating the tradition, which is alive, but it's alive because it's changing.
Thank you very much for this. Congratulations again for all the things that you're doing, and with the Cultural Institute, and very, very useful and intellectually fulfilling. It triggers a question. I've only had 2 questions for you. I know you are very, very busy, so I don't want to keep you too long. But one question really triggered from what you just said, and it is, you mentioned the postmodern era, an era which is the social media era, the era in which everything is fast, the visual era. We have to we have to see. If we don't see, we don't understand, because we see and read. We don't read and see as we used to do. In other words, it's not better, it's not worse. I have no criticism or judgment, but the question is, it seems to me that sometimes we lose the context in an era like this. And how do we deal with the context? I mean, the text doesn't have to be a text. It can be a movie, or it can be a work of art. But how do you deal as a scholar and as a cultural institute in portraying at the same time text and context? That is, that there may be something that could be out of place nowadays, but is still worthwhile being studied from an artistic point of view, from a cultural point of view, because this goes back also to the issue about the difference between the academic systems a little bit.
So you are right, and on one side, of course, we are dealing with a sort of a decontextualized memory of the past, which is what many contemporary artists are fond of. And we must accept that our culture is often a culture of decontextualization. I mean that our historical approach, which is a very Italian, a very Croatian historical approach, goes back to Vico, to the idea that every event is correlated to a general landscape, to an historical age, to an historical context. This is something that's a new culture. Of course, sometimes context is fighting against, and in a way we had an example of this, for instance, in Umberto Eco. Many of his books use in a decontextualized way many elements of the past, and he knew very well, of course, history, but he decided to produce this postmodern play about histories, ages, and decontextualization. On the other side, I think that we must contextualize in a different way. For instance, there is all an history of women in the past, which is connected to the history of women in the present, that can provide a different context to works, and also a different way of consider all the elements of the past. This is also something that we should do, thinking that the past, the context is not always the same, but that history must be changed also according to our interest, and we can discover new sites, new passages, new region of history. I am finishing a wonderful book of Chiara Frugoni about women in, I don't know if I read, yes, this is in Italian, I hope it will be translated soon, Donne medievali. I am not promoting my book, you see. This is for me Sole Indomite Avventurose, just published by Il Mulino. This is for me a perfect example of how we can deal with history, with context, but at the same time re-elaborate the past, revisit the past, because we can have a new way of dealing with it.
Thank you, thank you. And finally, I have one last question. You already answered, in a sense, anticipated in some of your comments so far, but basically, more generically speaking, how do you see the Italian and the American cultural system? What are the basic ways and differences in dealing with problematics that affect the arts and humanities in general?
I think that there is a problem, at least in the United States, connected with money. I'm sorry to bring this up, but the cost of private universities, the expenses, the tuition is so high that many students have to end their university with the burden of a big debt on their shoulders. And of course, families ask them to take courses that allow them to repay that debt. This means that I had UPenn many students, for instance, studying at Wharton, which is the big business department of school of UPenn. They were exceptional when they came to my courses, and they told me that literature for them were their passion. But they couldn't afford to take a humanistic or a literary degree. So this is the basis of a free education, a problem that is really crucial in Europe and in the States. How balance business, we could say the fact that the university is also a business, is also based on money on one side, and the freedom of our students. Because if the burden of the debt and of tuition grows too much, humanistic studies will suffer, and this is not good, not for us, but for the students.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Fabio. I want to thank Professor Finotti for all the work he's doing for Italian culture in the United States, which is amazing anyhow, and for all he's doing as a scholar and as a professor, of course. And thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you, Andrea. It was a pleasure, and I hope we will collaborate with the Olga Ragusa Foundation as soon as possible.
I hope so too. Thank you. Thank you.